to come over to participate in this program in the past, and we're glad to have her back. And I think she's very happy to have interactive discussion as we go along, so don't hesitate to interrupt. We have a couple of people who are joining us by the web, so if you can repeat any questions that happen here. And I don't know, sometimes they have to be muted because there's too much background noise there, but if you hear a voice coming out of nowhere, you'll know what that's about.
All right.
We usually take a break around 9 for a little bit. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That was early, and I apologize for being late. It was a little bit of traffic coming from Tuscaloosa, and then I got here, couldn't find parking. Lovely. Okay. What I would like to talk about this morning is qualitative research. There's this really cool new methodology I just learned from a colleague that after our break, I want to talk about that too. It's more of a mixed methods approach, but it's really interesting. So I just want to make sure I don't have slides for that, but I will get some slides together and send them to Jean just to give you some references. I learned about it last week. I thought it was really cool, so I wanted to share that with you. Something that'll help orient me, if you could just quickly, for those of you in the room, starting to my right, just tell me what you do here, that would be helpful.
My name is Howard Jackson. I'm in the Department of Neurology, Division of Epilepsy, and I focus on mainly like pharmacological research in epilepsy.
Tom Alston, Department of Epilepsy as well, and I do concussions.
Stan Markra, I'm a resident in radiation oncology.
Laura Dever, I'm also a resident in radiation oncology.
Robbie Richter, I'm a fellow, student faculty in Peace Critical Care.
I'm Miranda Brad, I'm a postdoc doing that precision medicine project for virtual myopathy.
I'm Brandon Roberts. I'm also a postdoc, and we study exercise in large-scale trial agent.
Oh, really cool stuff. I feel like I want to talk to all of you more about what you do. Okay. Just really briefly, I'll kind of go over qualitative research, theoretical approaches, some sampling methods, qualitative techniques, thinking about qualitative research in practice, flow of voice, which is really fun and interesting, community audits, software packages, and then some qualitative research and NIH tips about incorporating qualitative research into your projects. Some of you may know more about this than me, so I'm giving the talk, but if you have questions and or like, you know what, let's talk about that point a little bit more, I'm open to that. All right, qualitative research, broadly speaking. This is really not just so you don't know broadly what qualitative research is, but to kind of make sure we're on the same page. This is a working definition of what I'm talking about when I talk about qualitative research. It seeks to gain a comprehensive and holistic view of social life through the study of people in a wide range of natural settings, and it is used to capture expressive information not conveyed in quantitative data about beliefs, values, feelings, and motivations that underlie behaviors. So a lot of what I do is actually mixed methods, is qualitative and quantitative. Sometimes what we found is you get results when you just do a quantitative analysis. They don't always make sense, or you kind of think you know what the hard numbers mean, but you're not sure, you just want more information. And kind of the qualitative data by itself or in conjunction with quantitative data really kind of broadens or enriches the data you have. Does that make sense? Okay. So my question for all of you, if you think about the research you're doing, if you've already done some, how can you gather good data? So how do you typically think about for your research questions getting good data?
What do you mean with data? You mean the high qualities? Or sometimes, even what means that in my practice, even I enroll the patient and then follow the patient. Sometimes we still will mix in some data. Is there good data?
That's a good question. Yes, that can be good data. And part of it, so like did you just give them questionnaires?
Yeah, sometimes maybe some patient will underwent biochemical examination, but sometimes we will not. What means that maybe due to different problems that data may not look good or maybe make sense. So finally, when you get the whole patient's data, you find out that some patient missing this data and other patient missing another data. So totally overall the data are not quite intact. So I want me to they influence the accuracy and then the results of the data, the data not.
Does anyone else, how you think about good data? The postdocs. That's what you're doing, research. How do you all think about getting good data?
Repeatability is our big thing.
Yes. Did you see the same thing or making sure your results kind of hold up over time or repeated measures? Anything else?
Usually, I've always wanted to have a comparator group that was one that really revealed something, a comparison between normal and whatever I'm trying to study that is different from normal.
Yes. Just to really measure if you have the data. And here's the next part of that. Honestly, these questions are really just to get you thinking about data in different ways. And what should you do with the data? And that's where I think the qualitative methods can be helpful. But once you collect all your data, what do you do with it?
Statistical.
You do your statistical analysis, and then you, I'm assuming you do that to then go publish it. Or possibly give a presentation at a conference with an audience of your peers interested in the data. Anyone else do anything else with the data? Okay. Let me challenge you with that data. So now you have your analyses, you put it in a publication, or you present it to your peers, and a lot of what we do, as psychologists, we talk about like sex week. So when I'm talking to my discipline peers, I talk in a way that probably doesn't make sense to most other disciplines. And that makes sense. My husband's a business professor, so sometimes when we were in graduate school, he would go to dinner with me and at the time, my classmates. We were talking about someone being access to cluster B. Like, people don't talk like that. Like, what does that mean? And what does that make sense? So sometimes we do all our fancy analyses and we publish our data, but the truth is it doesn't have relevance for anyone outside of our discipline. This is becoming a huge problem. So this is kind of like a side plug for qualitative data, but just thinking about whatever data you do. If you notice, if you've submitted any NIH grant proposals in the last couple of years, they now ask for a paragraph to explain what you're doing in common language. And that's why, because we do all this fancy stuff, but it actually doesn't make sense to people outside of our discipline. And the people, like Congress people, that's where the money comes from for NIH and NSF. And they want to know what we're doing, and they want to understand it in basic terms. Okay. So that's one reason I think qualitative data can be helpful, because the truth is we do all our measures, even if we do all, however we get to collect our data. When you do qualitative methods, you're actually asking people the questions, and you have to find ways to ask those questions in ways that the average person understands, if that makes sense. So then it kind of forces you to think through what you're doing. And what you really want to know, and then even if you're doing kind of a mixed method, you have your quantitative data, however you collected it, your qualitative data helps you understand that even better. Here's a simple example, but I hope it makes the point. So I do a lot of research with grandparents who raise their grandchildren. Okay? I did a study in rural Alabama, primarily an African American sample. And when you ask them, like, this measure of religion and spirituality, they talk about being religious but not using the church for support. That makes absolutely no sense with all the literature that says the African American women use the church for support. I'm like, okay, I don't get this. Like, it just didn't make any sense. Like, did we not ask the right questions? We used the wrong measure. It made no sense. But luckily, we asked some qualitative questions, and the question was, where do you get your support? When you kind of look at them together, what we realized is people, they were study participants, they were going to church to give support to others, but that's not where they were going to get support, because they didn't want to talk about the reasons they were raising their grandchildren. Does that make sense? But it was the qualitative data that helped us figure out these really odd quantitative findings. Like, it just didn't make any sense based on the literature. So kind of putting them together really helped to make sense of the quantitative data that we found. Does that make sense? So that can come up like in lots of ways. That's just kind of a small example to get you to understand that. But just sometimes just asking the questions, if you're doing questionnaires, is not enough. And sometimes even if you're taking measurement data, just the measures themselves may not give you the whole picture, but sometimes just the qualitative component of that, again, with the quantitative data or qualitative by itself, can really kind of help you understand better your results. Okay. Ways to think about the qualitative data. You have grounded theory, and that's theory that emerges from the data. So you ask people all these questions, qualitative questions, and you get the data. Once you get the data, you try to figure out where your themes are. Does that make sense? Like, you know, most of the respondents said this, and you kind of put data together by your themes. Another way of doing that is superimpose theory, and you start with the theory, and then you determine if your data supports your theory. And those are two very different ways to approach qualitative methods. One is, let's collect the data and see what emerges. The other is, let's start with what we think is there, design our questions that way, and then see if it confirms what we thought. Does that make sense? So two very, very different ways to think about qualitative.
So we talk about a lot about testing a hypothesis.
Yes.
Do you view the superimposed theory as really bad, or is it different?
No, that's exactly what it's doing. That's exactly what's happening. Yes. So that's really much more what the superimposed theory does. All right. In terms of sampling, you can have propulsive sampling, quota sampling, or snowball sampling. I'll define those in a second. And maybe I won't. Okay, I'll do that right here. So propulsive sampling is you just kind of, one second. You think about your sample, where you can collect your data. You come up with a sample size, often based on what you see in the literature. Does that make sense? Like you study in your area, and you can, that kind of helps you determine your sample. Quota sampling, you really do kind of do almost like the same type of sample size you would do for quantitative data. And that's how you determine your sample. Again, a lot of that is based on looking into literature, and snowball is very, very different. Snowball techniques, if you were my participant, you do my interview and I ask you if you know someone else like you. Does that make sense? And so snowball, you kind of do it much more by like a referral basis. And you can kind of, snowball has been incredibly helpful, particularly if you have hard to reach populations for qualitative data. Because typically, if you think about your own life, you know people who have some of your shared experience. So for me, if I want grandparents who are raising their grandchildren, they know the other grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. They can tell me how to get my sample. They can tell me how to get those grandparents who are around their age, who are about the same race or different. They know their population. If I want to look at ask qualitative questions, I worked with a colleague on this who wanted breast cancer survivors. Persons who have survived breast cancer, they typically know others who have also survived. Does that make sense? So typically, the snowball technique has really been helpful to help with data collection and making your sample. Qualitative techniques, you have observational studies, and those can be unstructured data collection, structured data collection. I'll go through these in just a second. For unstructured data collection, it's just observational. You can kind of go to a park, for example, and observe children. Like if you're interested in children in play, go to a park and you're just watching all the children there. You see how they play. How is the play gender-based play? Is it play by age? Does that make sense? I mean, kind of have some questions in your mind, but you're just observing what you see. You can go to different types of parks, different parks. Structured data collection is much more like we think about kind of quantitative or collecting quantitative data. You want to categorize the phenomena. Even if we take that same, you want to watch children play, you want to watch them play in what kind of parks? Parks in neighborhoods that are more resource laden. You want parks in neighborhoods that are under-resourced. That makes sense. Those make you very different kind of parks. You may get very different kind of kids playing. You want to observe, if it's more structured, you really are focused on looking at gender play. You want to look at gender play in 4 to 6-year-olds. Just like you would set up more quantitative methods, you just come with a plan and that's what you're observing. Does that make sense? So the structure, you can still be categorizing the phenomena, you're paying attention to what you see. You can have checklists to make sure you're kind of checking everything, and rating scales. And here's the interesting part. It's very much like quantitative data now. Your rating scales, the difference is you can rate them, but you already, just like you would with quantitative data, you determine the scales you want to use, how you're going to rate them, and typically, if you're doing something like that, you have 1 or 2 people doing it with you. And you've already talked about to make sure you 2 of you or maybe 3 know how to do the same ratings. So you can hopefully, so you know that you're rating the same things, you're thinking about them the same way. So you can be a passive observer, an active observer, or a participant observer. A passive observer is just like kind of the unstructured data collection in a way, or that could be structured, but you're just watching. You're not, if you're at that park, you're watching people play, you're just kind of in the background just watching. If you are an active observer, you may be in the middle of where all the play is going on. Does that make sense? And you're kind of actively participating. Or you can be playing with them and still paying attention. So very different ways to think about your role in that data collection. Something I kind of want to go back and make sure I say, even if you're, we'll get to that. We'll talk about analyzing the data. Okay. So this is typically what people think about when you think about qualitative techniques, and that's interview central to the relevant group or process, and it's interviewing. You can do focus groups, so all of you could be a focus group. If I wanted to know about the clinical translational science program, you could be my focus group. I could ask you questions about this program, how beneficial it's been, how did you get involved, does that make sense? You could be my focus group. I typically, if you were my focus group, I would have my questions already prepared. I would ask you those questions, and alternatively, another method, well, focus group size, you can typically have 8 to 10 people in a focus group. Why 8 to 10? You can do a little bit smaller, maybe a little larger, but 8 to 10 seems to be kind of like the sweet spot. Any thoughts? Think about a real focus group. There are 8 of you. What if I made it 15 of you and I wanted to ask questions about the program? What would be the difference in just asking this group? So double the size of the group.
It allows more interaction. Maybe people aren't as nervous about talking.
Yes, it allows more interaction. People aren't as nervous about talking. But it also allows everyone to get a chance to talk. Yeah, you've all been meetings even. Or groups where like one person dominates the conversation and you're struggling to make sure everyone's heard. That gets harder to do when the group gets larger, to make sure everyone's voice is heard. And even, so typically if we're doing focus groups, I would not just be asking you questions, I would be audio taping, hopefully, and videotaping. Video is important. It's like even now you're nodding your head, so I know, okay, they got that one, I can keep going. Does that make sense? There's something you get from the nonverbals. So videotaping is great for focus groups because it allows you in real time to pay attention, but it also like things you may still miss. You can catch from the videotape. And typically you do focus groups with someone else, so that then the person asking the question, there's the other person who really is watching all of the nonverbals, making sure that there's not one person dominating. They kind of work together and play off each other. So groups in the size between 8 to 10 really allow you to kind of get all of your data, ask all of your questions, and keep the group running, moving. Yes.
It seems like, to go back to your initial points, which is getting good data, you need a very well-trained and well-prepared interviewer to obtain the data you really want to obtain, because somebody who's really well-trained can read body language and perhaps know nothing about the field, but be able to pick up, okay, I'm seeing that this person has something to add, but they're not saying something because of some interaction, and be able to use in a professional way something to get the information out of the crowd.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So you want to take so you have your kind of a facilitator and then your co-facilitator, and they are people, who actually know if they don't know the subject matter, they know questions that they're going to ask, they've thought about them. The questions are not asked random. You kind of start out with a general question and get more specific as you go, in part to increase comfort. Does that make sense? So yes, the interviewers are trained in how to think about focus groups and how to conduct them. And you can typically do that on most topics if you kind of have a format you follow. So it's not just like I wouldn't tell interviewers, yes, I may have to do a focus group. So again, size is important, kind of thinking through how to ask the questions. For example, if I'm asking middle-aged to older adults questions, more psychosocial questions, one question you always put towards the end, questions about money, right? Resources. People don't want to talk about that. So you make sure you ask other questions first, get everyone comfortable, and then you just ask questions, not to a person, but questions just about money or resources. You put those towards the end after you've increased comfort, but not the very last question, because you don't want them to leave to get want to know about my money or whatever. You just kind of put it toward the end once comfort is increased, and then you always get it with like one of those. Good may not be the right way. Some question kind of leaves, so thinking that was just lovely. And you always close by asking your participants if there's something else that you did not ask that they really want to make sure is covered. Does that make sense? These are the questions we have for you. Is there a topic that you think we should have included, or is there something you would like to say just to make sure there's not an important piece of information that you didn't think to include or ask about that participants may want to share that could be really helpful for your data?
Do people view focus group information with more or less settling the validity of it if the people all know each other versus if they're people who don't really know each other but share some of the common feature? Is that an important dynamic to sort of regulate as you assemble your focus group, or is that equally valid data thought to come from both groups of settings?
Wonderful question. The data can be equally valid, but it actually may just change how you ask the questions, and it depends on the kind of questions you want to ask. So I was on a dissertation with a student who is talking to people who work in child abuse across discipline. So you have like police officers, social workers, different, all facets of people who work in child abuse. She intentionally mixed the groups because she wanted to make sure per question she had all of the different ways you could look at that question represented. Versus sometimes when people know each other or you just have one group of people, it's too hard to make saturation, so you come back to the question until you get the same answer. For her, she wanted to make sure she was getting all the different opinions, so she thinks people. So that's going down like when people know each other. You may be more likely to kind of have people saying the same things. But I'm glad you brought that up. A really big deal to talk about when people know each other or when they don't. It can work either way. Maybe more important when they don't know each other is confidentiality. So you always start with ground rules. We're sharing confidential information. It doesn't matter what it's about. As soon as you conduct your focus group, you don't know what people may say, then you just kind of start by going over ground rules. If someone feels uncomfortable, they can always step out when it is needed. People should share it, and everyone should feel like the shared evidence is confidential. It's very helpful. Key informants are a really, really great way to collect focus group information, but also a neat way, actually, they can help you with your project. Key informants are people who know your subject matter and who are typically key to helping you understand your population. Okay, if I was doing breast cancer research and wanted to talk to people who were newly diagnosed with breast cancer and their thoughts about the process, like what the information explained to them well, did they understand what needed to follow up? What type of person would be a good key informant to help me understand my population? Who probably would know my population well, give me some good data about persons newly diagnosed with breast cancer?
The survivor.
Yeah, a survivor would be a great person. Who else may be a good key informant? A nurse? Yes, a nurse. Does that make sense? A nurse. I know this will seem odd. So if I'm doing stuff for me, I've done a lot of stuff in rural Alabama. When I'm doing stuff with grandparents raising grandchildren, typically they're raising their grandchildren because they're an adult child of a substance abuser. It used to be the crack cocaine now. The opioid epidemic is kind of typically it's substance abuse. A good key informant, if I want to ask someone just about my population, some of the new challenges, actually it's odd, but particularly in rural areas, it is a pastor's wife. They know lots of stuff. If you get a pastor, and I have had this, it was like hidden Peter, a pastor's wife who was a social worker. I know about the population, I know where to find them. Does that make sense? Your key informants can really kind of inform the process really well. And they may be people you don't necessarily, like they're not kind of your logical go-to at first, so you have to kind of think through your population. But those can be really, really key people. In small towns, it may be the mayor or someone on the mayor's staff. So I've done some stuff in parts of rural Alabama. The mayor also owned the local funeral home. These are people who know things. So think out of your box a little bit for your key informants. But they can be incredibly helpful doing a study with key informants to understand your population. But also they can just help you recruit your population too.
Are there ever any kind of privacy issues with that? With an informant, you know?
Yes, so we always, for any research project, you have them do the consent form and talk about confidentiality. So typically what we do to deal with confidentiality is a great question. So I do work with a social worker who was a pastor's wife. I will say to her, can you give out my flyer to all of the people you think are appropriate for the study? Does that make sense? So she knows them, and then they can kind of contact me without me knowing all the people. So if you choose not to contact me, then I never know about you. So that's kind of how we deal with some of that. When you have key informants individually, and you just have to talk about confidentiality and what I really need, like you don't ask them ever the name of people in that setting. You're just asking more about the population of interest and not necessarily about them. So that's a very good question. And that came up a lot with working on like child abuse cases, really staying away from a particular case, but just talking about questions more broadly speaking and more the process and things that are important in the actual. But that was a really great question.
It seems like there's no way to avoid that the informants you're using, they have biases that are important in what you're doing, but so I guess you don't try to avoid it, but how do you discover bias in a way that helps you be sure that you're still getting the information that you want and it's not being filtered in some way that somehow misleads you?
That's a really good question. So part of what you do, which is why it's nice to do this in conjunction with someone else. So if you're doing focus groups or with your key informants, you're typically making notes on the side. And some of those could be, that response seemed really, the person seemed a little agitated, or this may reflect some bias. And you're always asking more than one person. So what you're really trying to do, does that make sense, to see where you have a convergence of data. And that does help you get around just any one person's particular bias. But that's a really great point. It does come up. Yes.
Just a comment to that. I think also the criteria for rigor in qualitative research is different than quantitative. So rather than trying to find something that's generalizable, that certain types of bias would definitely be a great concern, you're looking for something that's transferable. So it might not necessarily transfer to the global population, but certain populations that have particular characteristics that might be similar. So I don't know if that's another way to think about how to manage bias. It's what the goal of the research is as well.
Yes, that's well stated. But again, it is nice though, because sometimes people do have their own agendas. But really making note of that, like everything becomes something just to kind of keep notes. So when you do really good qualitative research and look at someone's notes, you do see like the side stuff, like here are your major themes that came up, here's all of it. Let's think about that. Was there research on that point? It's really nice to keep up with that information. You can have critical incident reports, and that is kind of, case reports may be a way to think about that. So thinking about just a report, you can analyze it and all the things that are involved in just a particular case or a critical incident. Just a different way to think about the data. for your interviews, you can have structured interviews, semi-structured, and then unstructured. So a structured interview is you already have your questions outlined. Like I know every single question I'm going to ask you, the order I'm going to ask them, I thought through that, and now I just ask you those questions in that order. Very structured. Semi-structured allows for some open-ended questions. So here's some questions that I'm going to ask you that are kind of standardized. I know I want to ask those, and then I will ask you some questions. Can you tell me about your experience? Does that make sense? Or do you have any additional things to add? So you kind of give the participant some say in the process, or if they want to say, or you kind of intentionally are leaving some room to make sure you're collecting all of the data, or there are not things that you don't know about or you're leaving out. So I like the semi-structure. Actually gives you a little bit of flexibility, may not be the right word, but it allows you to make sure you're kind of getting all the information you need. And another way, so for me, when I'm doing stuff with grandparents, I've been stunned by how many middle-aged people are taking care of grandchildren, but also and older adults. So the way we discovered that, okay, can you tell me about all the grandchildren that under 18 that you are the primary caregiver for? Is there anyone else you provide care for? Does that make sense? We've already defined what we mean by primary care. And I was stunned to find how many people are kind of doing primary caregiving at both ends of the workforce. Also, some of them were working, but you get the, so kind of some of the semi-structured or open-ended questions allow you to make sure you're capturing all that's really relevant for you for that population. And then your unstructured interview, here's my bias, I'm a little bit more on the structured, semi-structured side, but it's more kind of free-flowing and you're just asking questions and the participant may say something that then leads to another question. So it's not like, you know, if you're talking about caregiving, you don't go from caregiving to, let's talk about the cars outside, but you do have a lot more flexibility and it just kind of flows off of the respondent or the participant more than the structured or the semi-structured does. Does that make sense? There are probes. You can have a detail-oriented probe, an elaboration probe, or a clarification probe. These become really important. So someone may say something in response to a question. You really want to know, you can ask a lot more about that. So you have a whole set of probes. It's just like doing, the way I think about it, it's a really good clinical interview. So you may have a patient who asks a question and you write down the answer, but you can also follow up and just ask more detailed information about that, and that may be really helpful. I'll go back to my caregiving example, just because you're near my heart. Asking someone, so first, in terms of your questions, always having, and I didn't say this before, I apologize, an operational definition. So when we do caregiving research, it's really important to operationally define what you mean by caregivers, because typically spouses don't think of themselves as caregivers. They just think they're doing what they do. Does that make sense? So if you want to give really good information, you have to operationally define what you mean. A caregiver is someone who takes care of, in this case, I want family caregivers, a loved one for X amount of time. Like you just keep kind of defining it to make sure you capture spouses. Because I can't tell you the number of spouses who do not show up on a caregiver because they don't think of themselves that way, but you want them. So you have to really make sure you define it. So if I have someone who's a spouse and I ask, you know, are you the caregiver? Yes. Okay, how do you think about being a caregiver? And then they talk to me a little bit more about what they think about as being a caregiver. Do you have anyone who helps you? That can be a really big question. Yes. What do you mean by that? Here's what I'm looking for if I'm asking that question. And the detailed probe is to sort out informal assistance from formal care. So, well, my daughter comes and helps me. When does she help you? What does she help you do? Is there someone else who helps you? Do they help you with bathing or dressing? If not, is there someone from an agency who comes and help you? Does that make sense? Like just to really make sure. You can ask some of that in the structured format, or you can do that by just a detailed probe to make sure you can separate informal versus formal care. So a detailed probe. An elaboration probe could be, well, I am taking care of my my husband. Okay, you've taken care, how long have you taken care of your husband? Just to kind of get more detail.
Do you, with regards to operation definitions, do you define what taking care of?
Yes, great question, yes. You define really and truly as much as you need to. Right now, I could, okay, we'll do this. Just caregiver. What does that term mean to you? I'm not going to ask you to tell me, but I'm willing to bet at least we would have 3 different definitions of what caregiver means. Does that make sense? So whatever your question is, it really is important to operationally define what it is you mean by that and not assume your participant or respondent knows what you mean. It's just not a good idea. We all have different, because we all have different experiences, we all bring different definitions to the table. Are you all familiar with the term client or consumer? Do you think about that the same way you think about a patient? Oh, good, okay. I started doing some stuff in rural mental health center and they called everyone consumers and it was just really messing with me because I think about consumer as someone who's like if I'm in a grocery store or in a department store and I'm like, consumer. But like I kept thinking patient or client in my mind just to me. Because it just, that term was not working for me. But the term patient or client didn't work for them because they had been talking about consumers for so long on purpose. I mean, so it's just kind of making sure everyone's on the same page and we're all using terms that we know and understand. Even talking about, I asked them did they do a cognitive screen. And they actually were doing one, but they didn't know that they were doing one. So can I see the battery that you use when someone is new to your setting? Does that make sense? And then from there, I can figure out the terms that we needed to use and how we need to talk about it. Does that make sense? So the better you define what it is you want to know, and the more information you gather, the better the information you get, and it also helps you just to work with the population of interest better. Really, really is helpful. Okay. Have any of you ever done a case study evaluation? It can be really interesting. And they're journals, by the way. You take case studies. And part of that is like if you have a really interesting case and it's different from, like if it's a breast cancer case, but this case, for whatever reason, is particularly different, you can actually write it up. But that means you kind of talk about the case, why it's different, and you spend a lot of time, that's what you're doing. You're like, why this is important for us to look at. So I've only done one myself, I'll help students with you, but I did one on an older woman and talking about sexual dysfunction. But the truth is we don't talk about sex and aging a whole lot. Don't do it. So it was a way to talk about sex and aging, but it was also a way just to kind of deal with how do you work with an older woman who has some sexual dysfunction issues. Does that make sense? So that's kind of why we wrote up the case. But it meant really paying attention to all of the data we had collected from this person. And typically when you do case evaluations, it's de-identified data. So you don't really care who the patient is. We changed her name, her age, kept her still within overdose, but very different. But what you're really trying to do is kind of highlight some of the things that came up in that case. And you're doing that for the benefit of your colleagues in case they run across this person or just to broaden their thinking about a particular population in that way. So I wanted to broaden thinking about how do we think about older women. But again, it can be really, really interesting, and you just, if I didn't attach them to the end of this, I would send them to Jean, just references and talk about how to do a really good case study evaluation, but that can be incredibly informative and helpful. Qualitative techniques, recording and analysis of key interactions. I talked a little bit about this, audio taping and videotaping. Again, videotaping to me is the preferred methodology because it gives you a chance to get the nonverbals, which you miss if you just do audio tape, but sometimes realistically you can get cost issue. Audio tape is still much better than nothing. Why would you do videotape or audio tape as opposed to just relying on your notes?
miss.
Exactly. You miss something and you'd be stunned at how much you miss in your mind in real time. You're like, I got this, I'll remember everything. And but then you don't. You're like, I think that was important. You just don't remember. You don't remember it well enough to then use it to analyze the data or to use it for anything other than, I think that was really important for us. So it's really nice that at a minimum have the audio tape, but the video tape can be helpful. So you, as a facilitator or the co-facilitator, just aren't relying on each other for all the important things that happen in an interaction. So when you audio tape, adults in particular, kids think it's fun. But sometimes adults don't want to be audio taped or video taped for confidentiality reasons. It just feels wrong and invasive. So typically what I will do, or, and I can't tell you how often this comes up, they just think they'll sound funny. So what we do is like, I'll say my name and you say your name and then we play that back. They're like, oh, that's not that bad. You want to say a little bit more, or you just play around with it. Like just get them comfortable with the equipment. Then we're all good. Does that make sense? So again, we really have moved to, as a society, to think a lot more about confidentiality and privacy. So I wanted to be respectful of that and just allow people to ask questions about the technology and feel comfortable. Even when you're videotaping, it's stunning how quickly everyone forgets that the videotape is on. It's not really a barrier, audio or videotaping. After the first maybe 3 or 4 minutes, people are just good to go. So it works out really beautifully. But don't assume that you don't need to take a moment to make sure everyone's comfortable with your technology. Okay, this is really important. Attention to data validity. So triangulation is a collection from independent sources using different means. So basically when you triangulate your data, you're just thinking about how many ways can I make sure I am answering my question. If my question is, my question is caregivers, and I want to know how many people are caregiving. I can ask caregivers. I can also look in the literature to see what's coming up in most caregivers. I can ask key informants what kind of caregivers they see. So if I'm working with older adults, I can ask the AAA, the Area Agencies on Aging. They have a program for caregivers who they're seeing. I mean, there are lots of ways to make sure you're kind of triangulating your data. If you're just asking a participant, you can ask the participant the same question in different ways to make sure you're getting your data. So triangulation can be different sources of data to make sure you're answering your question, or it can be within a participant, different ways of asking about the data. Does that make sense? Here, I know. Happens all the time. Data is being triangulated almost all the time in its age. What? If I want to know how old you are, I ask you how old you are. Then what else do I ask you?
When did you graduate high school?
When did you graduate high school and your birthday. Does that make sense? Yeah. Particularly like when you're working with older adults and older women. Older women are lovely this way. They often want to, they'll tell you lots of things, but they don't want to tell you how old they are. So asking, how old are you, but then also asking your birth date. It's really funny. Sometimes those two are not the same answer. And then like asking when you graduated from high school, so another piece of information, that's triangulating the data. Does that make sense? To really kind of make sure you got the data that you need. Feedback from study participants is incredibly valuable. It's typically done at the end of the study, just asking, was this question, were the questions what you expected, or the interview what you expected, or focus group what you expected? Are there things you wish we had asked you that we didn't? I mean, there are lots of ways to ask that question, but you get the point, like really making sure your participants can give you feedback. Why does feedback matter, particularly if you're doing qualitative interviews? Let's just say I want to do 4 focus groups, same population, and this is my first one. Why does the feedback matter? Exactly, right. I may need to refine some of the questions before the next group, or at least it kind of gives me a heads up, like this question I may need to explain more, be prepared that I'll get more feedback or something. Does that make sense? actually focus groups really did help us, those of us who study caregiving, to figure out that spouses don't think of themselves as caregivers. So that means when we're talking, are you a caregiver? That's not the question to ask. The question to ask, are you the primary caregiver, talk about family caregiving, are you the primary caregiver for a loved one? And that typically includes, do you help with bathing or dressing or helping them prepare their medicines? You kind of go through to help people think about the duties, a very different topic area. They learned this from focus groups. The literature on men having sex with men. If you're in a prison population, if you ask someone, are you gay? Everyone says no, or primarily everyone says no. If you ask someone, have you had sex with another man? Yes. So before they were asking, were you gay? No. But all these behaviors are going on. Does that make sense? So they moved away from the labels and just started asking more specific questions to find out what they really needed to know. Does that make sense? This is the truth. Actually, CDC really did have to move away from the label to ask more specific questions. So that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. Sometimes the labels may work for us, but they really don't work for people. People don't use them. If I want to know if someone's depressed, that's not the question I ask, right? I kind of go through the list of symptoms. Does that make sense? Because no one's depressed. No one's depressed, no one's anxious. We all admit to being stressed because that's like a cool thing to admit to. But you don't admit to being depressed or anxious. That's true, everyone's stressed. Everyone has too much to do. Okay, we say that. But we don't talk about anything else, if that makes sense. So you have to kind of, again, be able to operationalize what you mean by something and not just assume the label will get you what you need to. A thorough examination of your outline cases is really, really important so that you can kind of address bias that way. Like if you have an answer that's kind of way out there, or the response just seems very different than the other responses you got maybe in tone, really pay attention to all that. So if you have notes, you can pay attention to all that. Don't ignore your outline cases. They actually could mean something, or it may just mean there's whole other area you need to explore. There was a lot of people who were doing stuff with grandparents raising their grandchildren. They were typically thinking about just grandparents doing it because their child was a substance abuser. The number one reason, substance changes across race, by the way, but it's typically substance abuse. What they started hearing, though, was grandparents raising grandchildren, it wasn't substance abuse, it was the HIV/AIDS problem. Does that make sense? It's like, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole new population of caregivers who are doing this for a very different reason that no one had been tracking before. So those outlying cases became much more than outliers over time, but they started with like one or two grandparents saying, this is the reason why they were doing it. So you don't want to dismiss that data. It typically means something. So at least hold on to it or think about it, but don't dismiss your outliers. After this point, we'll take our break. Attention to data reliability. Very much like you would in quantitative methodology. So you want a detailed documentation of your analysis. Typically, for qualitative data, you have more than one person who's analyzing the data. So if it's focus groups, if it's individual interviews, you have at least, typically it's 3 people who are analyzing the data. Does that make sense? Why would you do that? Why not just let me analyze the data?
Inter-rater, right?
There you go. Right.
Reliability.
That's exactly it. Yes, you want inter-rater reliability. So everyone's trained and have the exact same training. They know how they're looking at the questions. They've already talked about how to score the questions, if the questions, or how to put them in themes. Does that make sense? Everyone does it separately, but you're kind of all starting with the same basis. And you want to see if you have inter-rater reliability. And if not, where is it there and what that could possibly mean. So you have, a parallel review by independent investigators, so possible, which is really great to have someone who's not affiliated, who knows the topic area, but is not affiliated with your study, to also be one of your investigators or reviewers of your data. So just kind of a very concrete example, if I have a student doing a dissertation, maybe this student or one of their research assistants helping them, me, and then someone like another, simply Becky, one of my colleagues who is not on the project but who kind of understands the topic more broadly. to also be that third reviewer. To look at the kind of the analysis to make sure the themes are right, the coding was done correctly. So really, you're still kind of analyzing your data. You're just doing it very different. It's not, no, it's not computer. Now they have lots of computer programs we'll talk about soon who do help you analyze your qualitative data, looking for major themes and that kind of stuff. But it's still so incredibly helpful to look at the data yourself and get a feel for your data and what's there. But again, we'll talk about some of those technologies. We'll take, you guys take a 5 or 10 minute break?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, how about 9, 10?
It's in the administration building, which is public right across the street. Just tell the guys up there and help the rest.
Good question. Thank you.
Very good. We record these, I hope that's okay, and post them on a YouTube channel. Also, so 2 of our trainees every week get to go to the IOB session. So a couple of people are leaving now, and they're sorry they're having to go because they're really enjoying it. But anyway, don't be surprised if there'll be too few then. Yeah, so this is, I was a bench scientist most of my career, so I haven't thought enough about all of this. My sense is that the community, so when I was a student, people doing this kind of work, I suspect they felt like they weren't respected the same way that people who were doing quantitative work were. But my sense is that that's changing. Do you have a, yeah?
Yes, so NIH, and again, old city office institutions,
That's right.
the NIH now has a publication talking about how do you incorporate qualitative methods in NIH proposals. So they kind of like have a guideline, and that's about 10 years old now. UNC, Chapel Hill, they have a whole week-long summer workshop on qualitative methodology. UNC to me is like one of the meccas of quantitative.
So we have this whole initiative for rigor, reproducibility, and transparency has been a significant focus of a lot of things that the CCTS has done recently. Is that expressed in the same sort of way in the qualitative research community? And
yes, it is now.
Specific guidelines of how to be more reproducible? Because it seems like that's one of the things that would be potential, I don't want to say weakness, because it's just the reality of that there are such subtle differences in the way people may do things that it would be very hard to really reproduce one person's study. Or is there now sort of common language and stuff?
Yeah, so they can kind of ask the same questions and see if the same themes emerge.
Right.
That's one way to think about reproducibility. I think Alan probably, I'll see her this afternoon. Because UNC really does do a week-long workshop on this, and there probably is a publication, I'm sure, that they have to do.
And there's a sort of bias in quantitative sciences to publish really the same finding, or the same question at least twice, or at least the second time it's in a much less prestigious journal. Is that the way it is for qualitative research also, or is there more sort of recognition that there's particular value in producing this, or re-examining the same question in a couple of different ways?
That's a really good question. Well, so you can ask the same questions, but typically, like maybe you did an urban sample and now you're making a rural sample, so like you tweak it a little bit. I'm trying to think. Yeah, but I would definitely send. They're both here. There's some references, but I will update that with some of the questions you was asking. I'll send those to Jean. I think that would be really helpful. And I want to look up this really cool colleague, Joseph Dollar. He's at University of Minnesota. He's been doing some really neat mixed methods stuff. And what he says is the mixed methods, he does cognitive research. It's really actually helped him.
So does that means, so that means how people think about things?
Yes, think and process information. So he's a he does aging, which is how I know, but he does neuropsychology stuff. So they're doing, so like they'll have the same patient in terms of triangulation, like they'll give him maybe a lot, but then they'll ask the same person all these neurological questions to do the paper pencil test. So they're looking to see if on the paper pencil, it seems like these parts of the brain are not functioning well. Is that what's showing up? Maybe MRI or some of that. But then they're now also asking people, in your day-to-day life, how you your business routine, and you check, which is kind of measure executive functioning. So they're trying to catch it, and it really is helping them sort out what the paper pencil versus the machine test to tell you in real way how. Did you actually feel functional? All the things that people should be able to function well. So people can actually engage in problem solving much better than they do. And what they're starting to be able to kind of really understand more. And actually, for those who are help to figure out how to do it. It's pretty cool stuff.
It's just like one of our, but it's so interesting. It depends on what project.
And it's just one project.
Well, they first about the new project. So they say typically we only have one new project. This is later to one hundred. And that's what they really like it. Then after that, they can probably like 20 or more. So it's usually they're all passed. Yeah, pretty good. Yeah. Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Hey, quick question. What is the name of the mixed methodology that Joe Donner was talking about? I can't find it. CR.
I'm not sure.
CRIS? Okay, describe it briefly to me, please. Yes, I don't need it for right now, but if you send me something more, that would be fabulous.
No.
Thanks. You could just send me the name of the book, I can get it myself. Okay, cool beans, thank you. Bye. Excuse me, if you all are ready, I'll go ahead. Okay. We kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of internal validity. We talked about triangulation, methods investigator. There's a whole triangulation theory. Part of the reasoning behind that is to make sure that, again, like with age, if you collect our data in multiple ways, you can kind of make sure what you have is robust, real data. Excuse me. Okay. So this is a question people often ask, like if you do focus groups or do interviews, when do you notice that? And the term that's often used is saturation. So when you start getting the same data, like when there's no new responses, when you can kind of answer for the participant in your hand, of course, then you know you've reached saturation. Does that make sense? That's the term. You've reached saturation. So sometimes you can design a study and you'll say, okay, we need 4 focus groups. But after the second focus group, or definitely by the third one, if there's nothing new, no new themes are emerging, it all looks the same, then you don't need to do that last one. Does that make sense? So saturation is the term when all of your responses are about this, are not about, but your responses are the same. Excuse me.
Question.
Yes.
So in objective quantitative data, you develop this sample calculation and sort of try to look in advance and see how many you're going to need. It sounds like, especially with NIH proposals, etc., this doesn't have that. Is that fair to say, or do you come up with some sort of, I think I need 5 focus groups or 6 focus groups based on the literature to answer this because of so many themes exist in this, but you have the potential to either shorten it or lengthen it depending on what themes arise.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, you got it. All right. And I plan to send you, I'll send it to Jean, who will give it to you all. It's a little dated now. I'll see if NIH has a newer version. But NIH came up with a guideline for how to think about qualitative research in NIH proposals. So that I think is still helpful. I'll just check to make sure there's not a newer one they come up with. But NIH did that for several reasons. One, to make sure when people were talking about doing qualitative studies, they were using language that would be acceptable, does that make sense, to reviewers. And the other part of that was to kind of legitimize qualitative research more. So people have been doing it, yes.
Do you place more of a focus on the area in which you do qualitative research regionally, geographically, versus quantitative research? Because I imagine that could have a larger bias in qualitative research than, I know that there's still biases in physiology, across different regions, but not as much, I wouldn't think, as in qualitative research. So I guess in the way you frame the study and in your results, you put a larger emphasis on the fact of the location it was done.
That's a really good question. So I've done more quantitative research, not necessarily like doing an MRI or something like that, but doing paper and pencil tests. And we still talk about where the data was collected because there's still some biases. The biases may just be, which is a real bias with any paper pencil test, is level of education. Does that make sense? So we kind of assume our respondents know what we're talking about, they can answer a question. That can be a bias. They try to get everyone to kind of do their questionnaires now at a 3rd grade reading level. But anyway, there's a whole long literature. Jennifer Manley has done a beautiful job. She's at Columbia talking about that, particularly if you're testing older adults, just the education bias. So are you measuring what you think you're measuring? Okay. So my response would be, yes, you need to describe that, but some of that still may matter depending on the quantitative methods you're using to answer your questions. So there definitely can be huge regional biases. But I was thinking about weight, for example. So I have colleagues who are doing nutrition and obesity kind of research. Really interesting. There are lots of regional differences about that. Even like asking people the same questions on an operational definition about what it means to be obese. The Southeast definition of what it means to be obese is very different than if you're asking someone on the West Coast. I grew up in San Francisco, and I've just been stunned at the differences just in thinking about nutrition and obesity. But I'm an NPR junkie. They did this a great story, by the way. I know it's a tangent. But they asked people in Alabama and Mississippi to talk about what it means to be obese. And people were saying, most of the responses were, like, if you go to the movies and can't sit in your seat. I'm sorry, that's what people thought about being overweight. So so it was just stunning how what typically academicians and clinicians think about as obese was when people thought they may have a weight problem. Definitely regional differences in that. Does that make sense? I'm fascinated just because I grew up in such a different region. Regional differences have always been interesting. But that's a really good question. So again, your study may need a longer time or a shorter time if you reach saturation of data. You can have member checking to make sure your data makes sense. The big one is peer review. So there are qualitative journals now, really good. Like there's the Qualitative Journal of Health, which is a journal that takes more health-related research articles, but it's typically not typically, it is with qualitative methodology. So definitely in those journals, actually people are complaining, that they are trying so hard to make sure qualitative methods are legitimate that they may be losing a little bit of what's important for the qualitative, but they're really well-respected journals, and there are lots of journals you can publish in. And just so you all know, if you're really interested, UNC Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, does a week-long summer series on qualitative methodology. And UNC Chapel Hill is one of those, particularly like within their School of Public Health, that is a quantitative place. They've written some of the standard textbooks in quantitative methodology, and they're doing a lot of the qualitative, kind of like the cutting edge qualitative research, and now have a week-long series. So they're doing some cool stuff. You can have low inference descriptors, negative case sampling, reflexivity, and audit trails. Those are just all ways, and again, I have some references at the end, but I'll send you some new ones based on the UNC workshop series. But they're just ways to kind of check on your data validity. There's some methodologies I want to kind of get to, so I apologize for going through some of these. Content analysis, a researcher's thoughtful reflections. This is why that's important. Again, I talked about kind of all the notes you keep in the side and all the things that may not show up necessarily in your write-up, but they're really important for you to think about with your data collection. So just being mindful of that, and researchers analyze the data based on themes. You have core themes that emerge. These are themes that come up across participants. That's really what your results are based on often. And you can add statistical packages. There's like in vivo is one a lot of people are using, but there's statistical packages that analyze your things for you. So you can say, how often does sadness come up across the interviews? Does that make sense? Like you kind of are helping the software, but you kind of put in there the terms you want to see, those major things, or if there's other terms that are coming up that maybe you didn't even think about when you do your data analysis. People like the software packages and find that they help with qualitative data analysis, but nothing replaces kind of sitting down, looking at your data. Does that make sense? Just looking at all your questionnaires, or if you have open-ended questionnaires, but looking at all your interviews and just kind of going through them, just to get a really good feel for your data. So advantages of using the software packages: it helps to organize your data. It's a place to store all your data. It's easy to retrieve. You can do a frequency count of words. How often does sadness show up? How often does cancer show up? Just different ways to think about it. Easier to examine the relationship between the data. You see sadness and cancer showing up together. These are just random examples, but you get that point. The disadvantage is it slows down the analysis phase. It may stifle creativity. So when you look at the data yourself, things may be coming up in your own head about ways to think about the data that you didn't necessarily think about when you started the project, that you may miss when you rely on the data analysis of the software packages. It doesn't do the thinking for you. Researchers, part of the analysis. People argue that is a disadvantage. If you collected the data, maybe you need to rely on the software or someone else and not be a part of the analysis. And you may lose the context. You don't know what was said before, so basically, if you're just looking at the software packages, they don't tell you what was. The software is analyzing what you tell it to analyze, and it's not looking at if this question is asked before that, this is what emerged. Does that make sense? Like there are ways you can think about the data differently that the computer is not doing. So there may be a disadvantage to not looking at the data yourself. And you can include more information as you input the data.
Are you familiar with anyone using any type of like artificial intelligence or software that actually reads facial expressions with videos?
I'm not, but when I can do some information, I'll find out about that. That's interesting. Because I do know that technology exists. That would be really interesting.
They use some software to analyze like the presidential debates was an interesting way to do it, and they had all these graphs that charted out their facial expressions. I thought at the time that'd be really interesting for something like a focus group, you know?
Oh, because people are.
Because there's so much nonverbal.
That's right. We are analyzing nonverbal. I just don't know if anyone's actually doing it with the software package. Yeah. That would be really interesting. I don't know, but I find that. I'm intrigued. That's a website that can help you with examples of coding. Coding, there's lots of ways to code data and so many different ways to code the data. That's a website that can kind of help you think about how you want to code your data with examples and resource materials. This is really cool. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Photo Voice. So the Southeast Mississippi River Delta, Central Valley of California, and Appalachia, that's where I normally get this talk with my colleague Michelle, who now left to take a job out of Alabama. She's done a lot of Photo Voice, and those are the areas in which she's done it. And it gains the perspective of the community. This is the cool part, I think. Community members photograph their communities and share stories and thoughts regarding factors that influence the physical activity of children in their rural community. That was the example. So you give people cameras and say, photograph their community. And like, what do you think? You give them kind of, like for that one, it was thinking about physical activity in a rural setting, which can be a barrier. It can also be a barrier in an urban setting for kids. Like there are kids who don't go outside after school because they don't live in neighborhoods that are safe for them to go out. When you get those participants to photograph their communities, it really gives you a more tangible feel for why they're not outside, right? So it's one thing for me to tell you that those neighborhoods are dangerous. It's another thing for you to see photographs of activities or dilapidated settings. I mean, it really, the photo voice really allows a nice descriptive way to tell a story without necessarily using words all the time. Or accompanied by words accompanied by pictures. And it allows community people to tell a story that maybe, unless you live in that community, you don't necessarily know the community the same way. Right? So they know where to go or what they want. I mean, it's a different way to understand the community, which is kind of cool. So here's an example. There's a lot of vacant houses that have a lot of drug and criminal activity going on. It's unsafe for the kids. And look how close it is to the road. I don't like my kids walking here. So see, that picture tells you something, but the participant statement that me saying it just doesn't the same impact. This is our park It used to be nice until the gangbangers came, and it's right next to the train track, so it's not safe for kids. This is a picture of a park that was in the making since 2003 for the kids in our community. As you can see, we've only gotten as far as the benches. Kind of amazing. But did that help you to kind of think about how you can use phone voice? It just comes alive in a different way. Oops, sorry. This is an example of a community audit in rural North Carolina, which is really interesting. So you windshield tours. You can drive through the community and observe social and physical characteristics. So you were the participant driving through their community, and they're talking to you about the community. It's a very different way to understand the community. Ground truthing is kind of part of community audits, people talking to you about their activities and objectives. You can have free, low-cost gyms, walking trails, grocery stores, community parks, etc. Food deserts, sidewalks, fast food restaurants in proximity to low-income neighborhoods. All of that, well, a lot of that was discovered by doing these community audits. So remember, you all remember the beginning of the Obama administration, towards the beginning, when Michelle Obama had the Healthy Communities Initiative, so she wanted more community gardens, and to reduce the number, to just encourage people to eat more fruits and vegetables. They spent a ton of money to put in community gardens. What do you think happened? Did people immediately start eating more fruits and vegetables? Not so much, no. So they did some really interesting focus groups on qualitative data to figure out why. Anyone have any idea why? This is fascinating.
Lots of reasons. One, people are creatures of habit. So, if you have something ingrained in the live your life, it's unlikely to change overnight.
Yes.
Without you understanding why people were change. A lot of times eating up here is just more expensive.
Yes. It called for it. They didn't think about that. Yes.
So that's obviously weird.
Yes. And that actually, what you said was a huge part of it. People were saying it costs more to really to maintain and keep up the community gardens, or even going to the grocery stores to get the healthier options. It was more expensive, and how much cheaper you could eat by going to your fast food restaurant and just getting food. And the other piece of that was that's what they have become accustomed to. So you can't just kind of modify your diet overnight, right? I have a colleague and a friend who's a retired nurse. So when I do support groups for grandparents, if I want to impact how the children eat, I have to go to the grandparents, right? But grandparents do things that influence the kids. But what the nurse said, which was beautiful, she gave examples that were helpful. If you cook your greens and when your water starts to turn green, stop, because that means you're cooking out all your nutrients. That makes sense. Like, she gave really simple, practical tips that were helpful. And then she talked about how to replace the foods. So they have this great initiative, but they just didn't think about our basic tastes. So my focus is psychology and aging. The number one reason why older adults don't go to nursing homes is not all the fancy stuff we figure out and people removed from loved ones, it's the food. If I eat this at home, if you place me there, I have to eat all the food that's bland without it. I mean, it's food. So they had this great idea, but not kind of realistically checking. But the way they found out what was really going on was to do some of this qualitative research stuff to really understand that it costs too much. They were not adjusting for taste. So if you notice, it went from just kind of this raw fruits and vegetables. Who did they start to target? Kids, yes, kids. And why kids? Exactly, because they're not as aggressive. Does that make sense? It's brilliant. I mean, you think that now it's kind of like, why you just do that from the beginning? But the thought was, we could just kind of introduce, all people need is healthier options. And that really isn't true. That's not all people need, particularly adults. You need other things. The kids, they're bigger that long. So you can kind of modify their taste buds. And you can talk to them about why fruits and vegetables are healthy. I'm in tough foods. I have two little people. And at their school, they have a vegetable garden. I can't tell you the grief I get at home because we don't have one in our backyard. I mean, that's a healthy thing to do. Really? But you get the point, like they're being indoctrinated really to think to vegetables and how important that is. Their twins tell me about it, and Chelsea will say, how many fruits do we have today and how many vegetables? I'm fascinated by just how much they're being indoctrinated into thinking about eating healthy. I like it, it doesn't bother me, but it's just a very different way. But starting with kids makes so much more sense than starting with adults and modifying years of adjusting for taste and money. Okay. Here we go. So when they want to know more about, again, the community audit, in community resources, they had just a small sample size of 6, but they did an initial community guide. They did ground truthing for the walking trail. Someone went around the neighborhoods to see where they could walk. And then they talked about realistically how you could get people to walk. Community parks, they had someone show them the park. Then they talked about the quality of the parks. And then they also looked at free reduced cost gyms. There weren't any. Then they talked about why they weren't there. You can really learn. So the reason why I'm a proponent, before I leave today, I'm going to tell you about this really cool mixed method approach. It's great. But I actually like mixed method. But the reason why I think qualitative data can be really helpful is it really does help you understand your quantitative data better, and it just helps you with the story of the community you're trying to work with. So, for example, we started a project in rural Alabama using Walmart gift certificates. That was not working as an incentive. I live in San Francisco. I'm just saying it was my first project in rural Alabama, so I'm trying to adjust. I was mentally trying to adjust to where I was. I thought Walmart gift certificates would be great. They didn't work because the Walmarts were too far away. So we stopped the project and did some focus groups. Does that make sense? To kind of figure out what would be a better incentive. So it was a quantitative project, but to understand how to really make sure I had my participants, we just stopped for a minute. So I ended up doing gift certificates to a local restaurant. That did 2 things. Everyone knew where the restaurant was, right? So there wasn't a problem with the incentive. They knew how to get there. They figured out how to get there. Transportation was not a problem. They figured out how to get to that restaurant to eat. And it put money back into that local community. Does that make sense? So the focus groups helped me figure out what was important to people in terms of incentives. So we came up with other ideas for other projects, but I just want to give you an example of kind of how and they liked it so much that I ran out of money before I ran out of participants. It worked beautifully. Other things the community audit does, so you have agreement between windshield tours and secondary data varied. Best agreement was for sidewalks and grocery stores. They had moderate agreement for fast food restaurants who liked them, who didn't. They had lower agreement for proximity of low-income neighborhoods and fast food restaurants. So basically, by asking all the different people, what did they agree on? The biggest deal, they felt like they needed more sidewalks and grocery stores. Okay, this is really a tangent, but it is stunning to me, having grown up in such a metropolitan area, to live someplace that there are not sidewalks everywhere. It's almost mind-blowing. That and not enough street lighting. However, what becomes really important, if you're like me, most people doing research are from urban areas and or have lived in them for a really long time. Does that make sense? So it really is helpful sometimes to be able to collect qualitative data to make sure you understand the population you're working with, or if you're working with, I don't know, breast cancer or sperm. If that hasn't always been the population you work with, like if you're switching areas or emphasis, sometimes it can be really helpful just to make sure you know what's important in your population. And it's just always encourage, like at least a focus group before you start a study, just to make sure you have the right incentive, you're asking the right questions. It really can just be really helpful. All right. Exercise. You have been given an opportunity to conduct a research study to answer the following question. What are the barriers and facilitators to physical activity in Birmingham? I'm sorry.
Going back to what you just said, I was intrigued by the idea of having a focus group before starting a study, and that makes good sense to me. How do you get that funded?
That's a good question. Darn money question. Okay, so typically universities have small seed grants, and that's typically the money you would use to get a focus group funded. Sometimes you can get the money from a foundation. So for me, it's aging related. I would think about the Administration on Aging or the Brookdale Foundation actually have a whole program for grandparents raising grandchildren, so I've gotten seed funding from them. Does that make sense?
So would it be considered pilot?
Yes.
Okay, even
Yes.
though you're not going to continue with that particular method, or you might modify the questions or something. Okay.
So kind of, if you think about it, like the first part of your research project. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes.
So for all of you, what are the barriers and facilitators to physical activity in the Birmingham community? Or, let me say that differently. I don't care what you think about that. I want to know how you would find out the answer for people who live here.
You have really disparate communities. You know, I think this gets at the heart of the socioeconomics of Birmingham, but I do think you're right. You'd have to get some focus groups and go to Avondale, go to Mountain Brook, and go to the different communities where topography is different, where socioeconomics are different. The access to parks or all those dynamics. I think you'd have to ask that question or a series of questions to ultimately get the answers.
You're right, and that's really why Michelle and I kind of posed this question. So you'd have to do all of that. Again, we have our own set of implicit biases, and sometimes the best way you can ask the same questions in a variety of neighborhoods, or just do a few focus groups with a variety of populations. I did my internship at Palo Alto VA, so that's in the heart of Silicon Valley. And although I grew up 30 minutes outside of Silicon Valley, I was stunned that every little community, like every few blocks, there was a little neighborhood park. If that's how you grow up, and if that's what you know, then think about, like, even no matter what you become, that is your idea about how the world works. Not every neighborhood or a larger area has parks every few blocks. It was stunning to me to see all, and really nice little neighborhood parks. So the kid, you don't have to go that far, but it would be safe to get to a park, right? That's very different than going in a larger urban area, or even not in such a high income, high resource neighborhood. I say that to say sometimes we have biases that we don't even know we have. It's just how we grew up or what we're accustomed to. So I really do think sometimes focus groups can just help us to see past biases we may not even be tracking. So for me, honestly, when I started doing stuff in rural Alabama, I wanted to do it with African American women. I'm like, I got this, right? That's me. I know who they are. Not so much. I grew up in such a very different city, very different part of the country. My dad owned his own business. My mom was a teacher. She got her master's from Berkeley. We were not the same people. Does that make sense? So I started out with like, this is easy. No, I had a research assistant who was from rural Alabama. She became, literally, she was kind of like, Dr. Crawford, you was someplace different, but she's really interested in this population. Where she became my ambassador. I'm like, this is crazy. But it was really helpful. Does that make sense? I mean, so you just never know. It helped me, and then I just gave myself a chance to learn the community I wanted to work in, and that was really helpful. So if you're working with a more diseased population, if you're still working with people, you really want to understand their responses to something. It still may be helpful to understand the population differently. Does that mean people respond differently because their diets may be different? I mean, you don't know what's impacting it. When you start to understand your population better, then it can be really helpful. So I encourage qualitative methods sometimes just to make sure you understand, even if it is the quantitative questions you want to ask or where you need to ask them. Maybe different neighborhoods across different income groups. It can make a difference. So before I forget, I do promise to send you more about this. I just actually, to make sure I do this, I just called my graduate student to make sure she sends it to me, and I'll just forward you what Deanna sent me. Okay, it's called the Cresswell, I'll send it, but it's CRESWELL, the Cresswell Approach to Mixed Methods. And they really talk about, we talk about kind of convergent data, like the triangulation of data. You can do that. They talk about sequential designs. But the whole purpose is to start your project engaging from a very thoughtful perspective in quantitative and qualitative methods, and it walks you through, which would be great for an NIH proposal, how to administer them both, and then use all that data, right? You can triangulate your quantitative and qualitative methods to then see what your research tells you. Does that make sense? Like it's just a different way to kind of approach doing your research projects and then how to analyze all your data to get. Yes.
Is it sort of generally felt that if you engage a participant in qualitative kind of research, that they then are excluded from the quantitative part of the study? Have you sort of polluted them for the quantitative part by having them engaged in the qualitative part? Or is that not usually an issue?
Not usually an issue. The question may be which you do first, depending on the questions that you're asking. So you may want to do the quantitative questions first, just not to kind of pollute or bias too much. Kind of you start with qualitative, they may be more thoughtful than they may be otherwise. So that part is important, but they actually address that depending on what your question is and how to think about that and how to include that as you write up your proposal. So it's just a really nice way to kind of think. And this method was designed by someone who was a kind of a hardcore quant person who then was like, wait a minute, there's some value in incorporating qualitative methodology. So I wanted to make sure I talked about that with you all, introduce that. And I know a few people who are using this methodology. It's not brand new, but and they're getting lots of NIH and NSF funding. So it's just kind of a nice, solid way to talk about quantitative and qualitative. Does that make sense? Kind of using them both. And the value of having that kind of mixed methods approach to your collection of data and your data analysis that can be helpful. My example of how a colleague who's doing some stuff, looking at cognitive processing, how people think and process information. He's working with a neurologist. They can collect neurological data. He's a neuropsychologist. They can actually do the kind of the paper and pencil neuropsych testing. Spelled well backwards, that's some intimacy, but other more advanced stuff, but still paper and pencil. But then they can also do some qualitative questions, how people are functioning in their day-to-day lives. And what they're finding is people are scoring horribly, like their executive functioning isn't working well, but they're actually problem solving. Okay, so they're finding it, does it make sense? Like they functionally look better than what they need the tests are showing. So the qualitative piece is just helping them to sort out how people are problem solving and then how they can actually maybe teach others how to do that. Does that make sense? So it's kind of interesting. For example, like people may not be able to tell you any longer how to get their prescriptions filled or how do you fill a prescription. What they do know how to do is tell someone else to go fill it for them so they still get the medication, right? But based on the data, you would say their executive functioning isn't that great. On the paper and pencil test, they could not walk you through how you fill a prescription. So then their cognition is actually done. Because they problem solved about how to still get it done. So that's that functional cognitive piece that can still be really, really important that they just haven't been paying enough attention to. Does that make sense? So there's kind of like what they look like on the testing data, but then how they're functioning and kind of connecting all of that to have a better picture of how people function. Which can be really important if you're working with someone to really understand that difference. My mom passed away last year and she had Alzheimer's. The part that amused me, the last thing to go was her ability to be critical, like in terms of fashion and stuff. Like one day she was like, you need to go get your hair done. Really? You don't know my name today, but you can tell me. So I know cognitively there was a difference. Okay. But again, I was sending you information about that. This is just the last part for me. The inclusion of qualitative approaches in NIH grant applications. Again, I'll kind of send you some of this information. Systematic description of the nature of the data collection methods to be used. The correct flow process will kind of help you figure out how to lay that out. There are other folks that do that as well. The presentation of clear and convincing rationale why qualitative approaches are not only appropriate for addressing the research questions at hand, but why they are the most likely to produce useful findings. Focused discussion of the universe studied and the sample recruited for qualitative assessment, including accounting for the relationship between the sample to the universe by using a clearly described sampling plan. Specification of the time frames that bound data collection, observations designed to sample variation across hours of the day, days of the week, or weeks of the year. For example, if you want to study parenting, it's really important, right? If you want to, depending on your question, do you want to look at the parents and the children in the morning as they do the morning routine? Do you want to get a sample when they come home from school, if you have kids who are school age. Does that make sense? Is it best to get a weekend sample or kind of study them over the weekend? Is an hour enough once a week? That level of detail, depending on your question, becomes really important in how you outline your study. Because if you think about it, all that may be really, really different. Careful presentation of the nature of the data to be collected. How do you talk about that? An orderly account of the analytic procedures to be performed, including specification of how findings can be interpreted. That's really, really important. And basically what they're trying to do is making sure with the qualitative data you aren't kind of interpreting it based on your own biases, that you really are letting the data drive your interpretation. Researchers frequently immersed in the day-to-day lives of their subjects make qualitative studies susceptible to measurement bias. So if you're doing more than just asking a person's questions, you don't know them, but if you're actually involved in what they do on a regular basis, that may bias your interpretation of the data. Researchers are not as detached or unbiased. Full disclosure has been suggested as a way to deal with the biases, and you can minimize bias in other ways by having other people look at your data analysis. And those are just my references. But it really is important just to acknowledge that there are biases, as we talked about some when you're doing qualitative research, how well you know the population, if you already know the participants you are working with. Do you already have, because you work with the population for so long, biases about who they are, how they should be responding. So it's always important to have someone else other than you look at your data analysis to just kind of get around some of your own biases. Does that make sense? That's a really quick overview, but I promise there are some references here, and to send you a few more just that I think will be helpful if you decide to engage in this type of work. But any general questions that I did.
Could you just comment on the value of focus groups versus like surveys or questionnaires that have open-ended questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Because obviously the surveys are much easier.
They are much easier. What focus groups do, again, if you keep them between 8 and 10, definitely not 1 and 10. Sometimes people play off each other. Does that make sense? So you may ask something and that focus group will respond, and that may trigger me to say something that if you just ask me a question on a paper and pencil, I may just answer the question and we're done. But there's something about that interaction between the facilitator, co-facilitator, and the group that really does give you richer data.
Yes, and you can do that like follow-up questions.
Exactly.
But, and kind of a larger study, would it make sense to have hopefully have every patient answer a questionnaire and then only a small subset of them do a focus group?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And sometimes your focus group can help you make sure you're asking the questions that really get to what you want to know on your questionnaire.
Okay. So do they maybe make more sense in more like pilot studies?
I've used them for pilot studies.
Okay.
Well, I actually used them, we were working on a grant and really wanted to understand kind of how to focus the grant a little bit better. So then we want to focus on just physical health or maybe some combination of physical health and mental health. So our focus group really was designed to kind of find out what were the pressing problems from the population perspective, not what we thought. Okay, a great example, my last one. I have colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, and they wanted to do a study with older adults. They wanted to provide some services for older adults, but they weren't sure what to provide. So you had a group of primarily MDs, some PhDs, and they were all kind of talking about diabetes information or information about, stuff, or health-related stuff. They did a few focus groups. What the older adults wanted was information about teeth, oral health. They were stunned. None of this investigative team had thought at all about oral health. And that came up. They talked about how their teeth are falling out. They want to figure out what they could be doing better to keep some of their teeth and how to think about oral health. Isn't that interesting? So they ended up kind of doing a series of oral health that then led to a grant proposal, but that's what they wanted. So the focus groups really did help them figure out just how to provide better services for them. So focus groups can help you kind of work out a grant, understand your population better, and definitely figure out what they want. Because sometimes we do assume we know, and they were all stunned, like, none of them. And UPenn has a really nice, like UAB has a dental facility, so they had a whole new group of people opportunity to partner with. It worked beautifully, but that's just something that was not on their radar at all.
And you may, and those groups have people who wanted to learn how to lead a focus group, how would they get trained for that? Is there a sort of standard sort of indoctrination or a way of helping people become effective doing this?
Yes, you would just, honestly, just partner with someone who's done them and they kind of walk you through it. But there are books you can read, and then there are small workshops you can attend, like UNC is a week long, relatively extensive process. But you can do something shorter than that, just kind of to come up to speed on the focus group. Maybe read, watch one, and then someone kind of walk you through it. That's typically the process.
So just for the group here, I don't actually know the spectrum of what's available here on our campus, but there is a group that we've used to help with focus groups around educational processes that is part of the School of Public Health. There's a faculty in Wild Heights who specializes in evaluation of things, and Jessica Wakely, who works with him, is really great as a focus group leader, but I don't know if she would be comfortable doing a medical question focus group. But, so, but it would be a place to start if people want to.
And preventive medicine has some people who are kind of specialists in more qualitative methodology. Monica Baskin is there, Isabel Skorinsky. I'm thinking of someone who is in allied health. She does a lot of more qualitative medicine. And Ann Smith would be the person, actually. Ann Smith could definitely connect you with all the people, but they do a lot of this. Some of this comes up with the Minority Health and Research Training Program. They have sections on just kind of mixed methods or just qualitative approaches. So there are lots of, this campus has a ton of avenues to get the training. Well, thank you all very much. You've been a great audience. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you.
I'm actually working on a project right now that perfect. And then maybe I could just ask about like a book or something that would help you understand. Okay, perfect. Thank you.